He doesn't answer, and yet the silence feels crowded. You can feel it in the way you keep checking the phone without really wanting to, in the way your hand reaches for it before you even notice, in the way a part of you still expects his name to appear, as if the screen might suddenly remember how to open itself for you. There is no message, no explanation, no clean ending, just that strange, suspended space where a woman can feel both dismissed and deeply involved at the same time. And that is what makes it hurt. Not just that he is gone from the conversation, it is that your mind still knows how to speak to him, your body still knows how to make room for him, your nervous system still acts like his absence is temporary, like if you wait long enough, if you understand enough, if you stay soft enough, the connection will naturally return to what it was. But this is where the pain becomes more complicated than a simple breakup, or a simple silence, or a simple man who does not know what he wants. Because sometimes what he loses is not access to your body. Sometimes what he loses is access to the part of you that kept translating him. The part that made his mixed signals sound meaningful. The part that turned his distance into mystery. The part that kept saying, maybe he is overwhelmed. Maybe he is afraid. Maybe he is not ready. Maybe if I stay patient enough, he will feel safe with me. That woman is not weak. She is not foolish. She is often the most emotionally intelligent person in the room. She sees more than she should. She feels what others try to hide. She notices the pause before the lie, the tension behind the joke, the tiny shift in energy when someone begins to pull away. And because she sees so much, she often becomes the person who understands too much for her own good. Carl Jung would have recognized something important in that pattern, not as a romance trick, not as a guarantee that a man will return, but as a psychological truth about projection, persona, and the unconscious hunger to be seen by someone who does not yet know how to see himself. When a woman keeps understanding a man, she can become the place where he goes to avoid himself. That sounds harsh, but it is not always conscious. He may not be trying to use her. He may not even know what he is doing. He may simply feel, in her presence, that he can be less coherent, less disciplined, less honest, because she will fill in the gaps. She will soften the edges. She will make the emotional weather easier to live in. And if a man becomes used to that, he may not fall in love with the woman as she is. He may fall in love with the relief she provides. That is a very different thing. This is why the silence feels so charged when she finally stops reaching first, because suddenly the room changes. The emotional scaffolding disappears. The man who is being interpreted begins to feel the full shape of his own confusion. The woman who is making everything easier becomes quiet, and in that quiet, he no longer has the same access to her warmth, her explanations, her patience, her emotional labor. He loses access to the interpreter, and what remains is the raw, unedited version of himself. That is often where ego begins to protest, not because he necessarily hates her, not because he suddenly becomes a villain, but because the persona he was using in the connection no longer works in the same way. The easy version of him, the cool version, the unavailable version, the man who could keep one foot out of the door while still receiving devotion from inside it. That version starts to lose power when the woman stops standing in the doorway waiting. There is a moment many women know very well. You stop sending the extra message. You stop making the first move every time. You stop explaining why something hurt. You stop offering emotional repair for a wound you did not create. You stop being the one who keeps the bridge intact. And then, at first, it feels like nothing happens. That is the deceptive part. The outer world can look unchanged, while the inner dynamic is already shifting. The phone is still silent. The profile is still there. The last conversation still sits there like a closed door. But inside the psyche, something has begun to crack. Not loudly, not dramatically. More like a tiny fracture in glass that only becomes visible when light hits it from the right angle. This is where the body tells the truth before the mind does. You might feel it as a tightness in the chest, a restless stomach, a strange heaviness behind the eyes. You might tell yourself you are fine, but your body knows when it is waiting for someone who has not earned that waiting. It knows when hope has become a habit. It knows when longing has turned into a role, and the role is often the hidden wound. Because the woman who keeps understanding him is usually not just being kind. She is often reenacting something older, a complex, an emotional pattern built long before this man appeared. Maybe she learned early that love had to be earned by being easy, by being patient, by not asking for too much, by reading the room, by becoming the emotional adult before anyone else did. Maybe she learned that if she understood other people deeply enough, she could stay safe, could stay needed, could stay chosen. So later, When a man gives her fragments instead of presence, the old pattern wakes up immediately. She does not just see a distant man, she sees an old survival strategy. And that is why it can feel almost impossible to let go. Not because the connection is necessarily fated, not because every silence hides a soul bond, but because the unconscious has recognized a familiar stage and stepped onto it without asking permission. Jung would call this the power of the complex. A complex is not just a memory. It is a living knot of emotion, expectation, and bodily reaction. It can make the present feel larger than it is, because it drags the past into the room with it. A man's silence can awaken not only disappointment, but abandonment. Not only uncertainty, but the old fear of being forgotten. Not only longing, but the deeper terror that if you are not useful, you may not be kept. That is why the woman keeps understanding him, because understanding feels safer than confronting the possibility that she is being emotionally starved. There is another layer here, and this is where people often misunderstand the whole thing. A woman can become so identified with being the one who understands that she no longer notices how much of herself she is sacrificing to do it. She thinks she is being generous, but a part of her is also trying to preserve the bond at any cost. She thinks she is being compassionate, but a part of her is afraid to become difficult. She thinks she is being mature, but a part of her is avoiding the grief of seeing someone clearly and not liking what she sees. This is not a moral failure, it is human, but it becomes painful when the persona of the understanding woman starts to replace her real self. The persona is the mask that helps us belong. Jung saw that clearly. We all need one. We all present ourselves in certain ways to survive social life. But when the persona becomes too rigid, it stops being a bridge and becomes a prison. The understanding woman persona says, be calm, be patient, don't overreact, don't demand, don't make him feel trapped, don't lose the connection. And underneath that mask, there may be another voice, quieter but more honest. I am tired. I am lonely. I am carrying too much. I do not want to keep translating confusion into hope. That second voice is the shadow knocking. Not the dark shadow people fear in a simplistic way, but the part of you that has been excluded from your own image of who you are supposed to be. The part that is angry. The part that is disappointed. The part that is no longer willing to be convenient. The part that knows a boundary is not cruelty. The part that knows constant understanding can become self-erasure. When he loses access to the woman who kept understanding him, he may experience it as loss, irritation, confusion, or even sudden interest. But for her, the deeper event is different. She begins to lose access to the version of herself that kept abandoning her own perception. That is the real turning point. Not whether he texts, not whether he returns, not whether he finally realizes, not whether he regrets. Those are all outer events, and outer events are unstable. They can soothe you for a moment and then leave you hungry again. The real question is what happens inside the woman when she stops feeding the pattern. At first, guilt often appears. Guilt is one of the most misunderstood feelings in this entire dynamic. Many women assume guilt means they have done something wrong. But often guilt appears when a boundary is new. It appears when the old role is being interrupted. It appears when your nervous system is no longer available for the same emotional bargain. You used to be the one who made it easier. Now you are the one who is not immediately available. You used to explain his behavior for him. Now you are letting silence speak for itself. You used to soften your standards so the connection would survive. Now you are letting the connection prove whether it can survive reality. And guilt hates reality. Guilt prefers the old script, the script where you are responsible for the emotional climate, the script where his discomfort becomes your job, the script where your needs are always one step behind his confusion. But the moment you begin to step out of that script, something in you starts to breathe differently. It may not feel peaceful right away. Sometimes it feels raw. Sometimes it feels like grief. Sometimes it feels like you are standing in a room after a long noise has stopped. And the silence itself is so loud, you almost want to turn the noise back on, just to avoid hearing your own heart. That is why so many women go back. Not because they truly want the same pain, but because the nervous system confuses familiar pain with belonging. And here is where Carl Jung becomes especially important. Because Jung would not ask only, what does he feel? He would ask, what is being projected here? What part of the psyche is being activated? What image is the woman carrying of the man, and what image is the man carrying of the woman? Sometimes the woman is not only seeing the man in front of her, she is seeing the possibility of being chosen without having to demand it. She is seeing the hope that if she understands him enough, she will finally be understandable in return. She is seeing the dream of emotional reciprocity through a person who has not yet developed the capacity to offer it consistently. That is projection. Not in a cynical sense, not as an insult. Projection is simply the psyche placing an inner image onto another person, and then responding to that image as if it were fully the person themselves. A man may be carrying an image of the woman as endlessly forgiving, endlessly available, endlessly patient. A woman may be carrying an image of the man as wounded, hidden, complex, and secretly deeper than his behavior shows. Sometimes, both people are in love with something that exists partly in the unconscious. That is why the bond can feel so intense and so maddening at the same time. The body is responding to something real, but not all of that reality belongs to the present moment. This is the painful paradox. You were not imagining the connection, but you may have been over-assigning meaning to the version of him that could only exist when you kept doing emotional work for two people. Once that work stops, the image begins to wobble. And when the image wobbles, the truth becomes easier to see. Maybe he did enjoy being understood more than he enjoyed understanding. Maybe he did lean on your empathy without building the muscles of his own. Maybe he did prefer the comfort of your patience to the discomfort of emotional accountability. Maybe he did hide behind silence because silence protected his ego from having to answer honestly. Ego is a fragile thing when it is built on avoidance. A man can seem detached while secretly depending on the woman's emotional presence to stabilize him. He can seem calm while actually being deeply regulated by her responsiveness. He can seem indifferent while quietly watching whether she still reaches, still checks, still waits. When that access is gone, he may not know what to do with the emptiness. And that emptiness can trigger regret, curiosity, resistance, or a strange delayed awareness that something has changed. But again, the important thing is not to turn that into fantasy. The important thing is to notice what happens in you when he no longer has the same access. Do you panic? Do you want to prove your worth? Do you want to send one more message that explains everything? Do you want to reopen the door just enough to relieve the discomfort? Or do you begin to feel, under the pain, a tiny and unfamiliar dignity? That dignity is the beginning of individuation. Jung used that word for the process of becoming more whole, more yourself, less split between what you perform and what you actually feel. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It is about no longer living entirely through the roles that kept you safe in the past. And this relationship dynamic often reveals where the split has been. The woman who kept understanding him may have been very good at being soft, but not always good at being clear. Very good at being patient, but not always good at being protected. Very good at seeing him, but not always willing to let herself be seen in her full disappointment. That is the shadow lesson. Because the shadow is not just the ugly part of us. Sometimes it is the buried truth that we have been too polite to admit. I am angry. I am hurt. I do not want to be the only emotionally fluent person here. I do not want to keep rewarding ambiguity. I do not want to confuse my empathy with devotion to my own disappearance. The moment those truths are allowed into the room, the pattern loses some of its hypnotic power. And this is where the silence begins to do something different. At first, silence can feel like punishment. Then it can feel like strategy. Then, if you stay with it long enough, it can become something deeper, a mirror. Because silence shows you what was being held in place by your effort. If the connection only survives when you translate, soften, explain, and chase, then what exactly was being connected? If his access to you depends on your self-abandonment, then the access was costing too much. If your understanding made it easier for him to remain unchanged, then your empathy was being used against your own center, even if no one said that out loud. This is why the woman's withdrawal can feel so destabilizing to him. It is not merely that she is absent. It is that the system no longer receives the same nourishment. The old arrangement was, he offers uncertainty, she offers meaning. He offers fragments, she offers coherence. He offers distance, she offers patience. He offers confusion, she offers understanding. That arrangement can look like love from the inside, especially if both people are hungry enough. But love without reciprocity becomes labor. Love without clarity becomes a loop. Love without mutual responsibility becomes a place where one person slowly disappears, while the other remains pleasantly unchallenged. And the body knows the difference long before the mind admits it. There is often a moment, After enough silence, when the woman realizes she is not actually waiting for him anymore. She is waiting for the version of herself that used to believe this was the best she could receive. That realization can hit like grief. It can hit like humiliation. It can hit like relief. Sometimes all three at once. Because grief says, I cared. Humiliation says, I stayed too long. Relief says, I can stop now. And if you can let those three feelings exist together without choosing only one, you begin to recover your inner authority. This is the point where many people would want a dramatic answer. They want to know whether he is thinking of her, whether he misses her, whether he is regretting the silence, whether he will come back when he realizes what he lost. But the deeper psychological question is more serious. What happens when a woman stops making herself legible to a man who has not been meeting her honestly? What happens when she no longer performs emotional intelligence as a service? What happens when she lets his confusion remain his own? Usually, the first thing that happens is discomfort, then guilt, then doubt, then the temptation to return to the old role. But if she stays with herself through that threshold, something powerful can happen. She begins to feel the difference between being loving and being available for erosion. That distinction changes everything. Because a woman can be warm and still have boundaries. She can be compassionate and still refuse emotional labor that is not being met halfway. She can care and still stop interpreting mixed signals as a form of intimacy. That is not coldness. That is consciousness. And consciousness, in Jung's world, is costly. It asks us to see what we preferred not to see. It asks us to stop romanticizing the wound. It asks us to stop calling confusion destiny just because it is familiar. Sometimes the man does feel the loss when the woman steps back. Sometimes the mask slips. Sometimes the ego reacts. Sometimes the emotional emptiness becomes noticeable only when her presence is no longer there to cushion it. But even if none of that becomes visible, the woman still changes, and that change is the point, because she is no longer organized around his response. She is organized around her own perception. That is a much quieter kind of power, but it is real. A woman who has returned to herself does not need to perform indifference. She does not need to punish. She does not need to teach a lesson. She does not need to become cruel in order to become free. She simply stops confusing access with love. That is the line many women eventually reach. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself. I no longer chase what teaches me to abandon myself. Let that sentence sit in your chest for a moment, not as a slogan, as a boundary, as a small internal door closing gently. Because there is a kind of woman who finally understands that her understanding was never meant to be a place where she disappears. It was meant to be a gift, and like every gift, it has to be given freely. Not extracted through guilt, not demanded by silence, not used as proof that you are the only adult in the room. When she begins to reclaim that gift, she becomes harder to manipulate, not because she is harder in spirit, but because she is no longer leaking herself into every pause. She can still feel, she can still care, she can still love deeply, but she no longer confuses love with rescue. She no longer confuses patience with self-erasure. She no longer confuses silence with a challenge to prove more. She no longer confuses a man's emotional ambiguity with her own lack of worth. And that is where the real ending begins. Not in the fantasy that he will finally understand. Not in the hope that he will suddenly become what you needed all along. Not in the promise that the silence will force him into honesty. The real ending is quieter. It is the moment you sit with your phone and do not reach for it. It is the moment you feel the urge to explain and let it pass. It is the moment you notice how much calmer your body becomes when you stop translating someone else's confusion into your own responsibility. It is the moment you realize that your dignity feels more natural than your waiting ever did. And if he ever does come back into your life, he will not meet the woman who kept making his distance easier to live with. He will meet the woman who can now see the cost of that role. If he does not come back, she has still returned to herself. Either way, the old arrangement is over. The phone can stay silent now without becoming a verdict. The room can stay quiet without becoming empty. The absence can exist without owning her. That is the deeper freedom. Not the freedom to control the outcome. The freedom to stop betraying yourself in order to keep a connection alive. And maybe tonight, that is enough. Maybe tonight you do not need to solve him. Maybe you do not need to decode every pause. Maybe you do not need to turn his silence into a story that keeps you emotionally available. Maybe you only need to notice that the part of you which kept understanding him has been asking for understanding too. That part is not asking to be rescued. It is asking to be included, to be heard, to be respected, to be allowed to stop carrying what was never yours to carry. So let the silence be what it is, not a command, not a prophecy, not a test you must pass, just a space where you can finally hear the difference between being needed and being known. And once you hear that difference, you do not go back to the old room in the same way. You leave the door open only as much as your peace allows. You keep your own center. You let the unanswered message remain unanswered. And you begin, quietly, to belong to yourself again. That is where the body begins to settle into a new truth. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in small, undeniable signals. You stop flinching every time the phone lights up. You stop replaying the last conversation like it contains a hidden code. You stop mistaking anxiety for intuition. And slowly, your nervous system learns that not every silence is an emergency. This matters more than people realize, because the body keeps score in ways the mind often denies. A woman who has lived too long in emotional uncertainty can begin to carry that uncertainty in her posture, her breath, her sleep, even the way she enters a room. She may smile, answer messages, go to work, keep functioning beautifully, and still have a body that never fully unclenches. Her shoulders stay ready, her stomach stays alert, her chest stays half open, half guarded, as if love might arrive and disappear in the same breath. When she finally stops giving him access to the part of her that kept translating him, the body does not immediately trust the change. It needs evidence. It needs repeated proof that she is no longer returning to the old cycle. That is why the late practical test matters. Not a test of him, a test of you. Wait before responding. Notice the urge to explain. Notice the urge to soften your no into maybe. Notice the impulse to rescue the connection from its own consequences. Then ask yourself one simple question. If I do nothing right now, what feeling rises first? If panic rises first, that is information. If guilt rises first, that is information. If relief rises first, that is information. If grief rises first, that is information. Do not rush to label the feeling as good or bad. Just let it reveal the structure underneath the attachment. Because often, what looks like love is actually a nervous system that has learned to chase resolution. And when resolution never comes, the psyche keeps hoping that one more explanation will finally create it. But there is a point where explanation becomes self-abandonment in a nicer dress. That is the point where the woman has to choose whether she is still available for the old role. If she is honest, she will usually feel two things at once. One part of her still wants the text, the apology, the sign that she mattered enough to be pursued. Another part of her is exhausted by the very thought of returning to the same emotional weather. That second part is the beginning of wisdom. It is the part that no longer wants to be the interpreter of a man who refuses to meet her in plain language. It is the part that understands that clarity is not too much to ask. It is the part that sees how much of her tenderness was being spent on uncertainty. And once that part becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. That is the shadow work in this story. Not becoming colder, not becoming harder, but integrating the disowned truth that your empathy was never meant to replace your standards. The shadow often carries the sentence we were taught not to say. I want more. I deserve more. I am tired of being the only one who understands. I do not want love that depends on my silence. When those words finally surface, they can feel almost dangerous because they threaten the old identity of the woman who is always reasonable, always accommodating, always emotionally graceful. But being graceful is not the same as being erased, and Jung would have insisted on that distinction. He would say that the psyche seeks wholeness, not performance. It seeks truth, not image. It seeks the integration of the parts we have hidden in order to remain lovable. So if you have been the woman who kept understanding him, the deeper work is not to shame yourself for it. It is to understand what that role protected you from. Maybe it protected you from feeling too needy. Maybe it protected you from admitting he was not giving enough. Maybe it protected you from the terror of being ordinary to someone who felt extraordinary to you. Maybe it protected you from the grief of seeing that your emotional intelligence was being met by emotional evasiveness. That grief can be brutal, because once you see it, you cannot pretend not to see it. And yet, there is mercy in that seeing. The mercy is that you are no longer asking your heart to keep paying for a connection that does not know how to receive it. That is the soft ending here. Not a triumphant ending, not a revenge ending, a soft ending. The kind where you do not need to announce your awakening to anyone. The kind where you simply begin to choose yourself in smaller, quieter ways. The kind where you stop over-explaining your boundaries. The kind where you let silence remain silence. The kind where you no longer confuse being deeply understanding with being endlessly available. If he has lost access to you, let that loss teach what it needs to teach. Let it show him, if he is capable of seeing, that a woman's understanding is not a permanent shelter. Let it show you that your compassion was never meant to be a cage. Let it show your body that peace is not found in waiting for someone to become clear. Peace is found in no longer betraying your own knowing. And if tonight all you can do is breathe a little deeper, that is enough. If tonight all you can do is stop checking once, then twice, then again, that is enough. If tonight you can place your phone face down and feel the ache without obeying it, that is enough. Because healing is not always a revelation. Sometimes it is a refusal, a pause, a quiet return, a decision not to keep interpreting what should have been direct. And in that decision, something sacred happens. You become less available to confusion, more available to truth, less willing to disappear into understanding, more willing to be met as yourself. That is how the silence loses its power. Not because he finally speaks, but because you do not need his words to come home to yourself anymore.